And welcome to this edition of the Native News Update on this Monday, September 19th. I'm your host for today's program, Paul DeMain. And today we go straight to Fort Hall, Idaho with discussion with our correspondent, Mark Trahant. Mark Trahant, it's been a little while since we last talked to you. We were going to get an update on the OMB report on the impact of budget cuts on Indian country. What did you find out from your look at that?
Well, OMB still hasn't come out with direct numbers on Indian country yet. But today, the president, through the OMB, came out with a plan that would kind of be the outline for what the administration thinks the budget ought to look like. And he too is saying there are things we can't afford and we're going to cut back in some areas, but he does say that he wants to do what he can to protect the vulnerable. One of the things I find fascinating in this new OMB report that I hope tribes jump all over is they propose the idea of selling off unused federal assets. And every tribe could go through and look for things that the BIA has on the reservation community or the IHS that it's time to turn over, ranging from old agency office buildings and houses to equipment.
It's not going to be anything like the surplus land sell-off of a century ago.
Well, who knows how it'll actually work? And that's today's report shows that the president has a good heart, but absolutely none of it is going to come to pass. The Republicans are going to kill everything in there. It has the word taxes in it, for God's sakes.
I suppose. Well, what are you thinking it's going to, you say that there might be some surplus stuff that's been sold. That's like stopgap stuff. Isn't it like having kind of a rummage sale because things are a little bit short this month and it gets you through a few things, but that's no long-term solution.
No, and I think what we really ought to hit hard on, and I wish the president would have, is that there are two issues, short-term and long-term. Short-term, the federal government has a deficit. That can be fixed. It's going to mean some tightening. Long-term, there's this demographic imbalance, and that's what has to be accounted for. The good thing is this report does take a look at Medicare spending, and cutting healthcare costs is the smartest thing we can do, but it still doesn't look at long-term versus short-term.
What are the, ramifications of some of that? For example, went to the LCO Health Clinic here, Indian Health Service, dental services. They have lost their dentists, so they were referring people out, but they're only referring LCO tribal members out for services. Any other enrolled American Indians, anyone else that might somehow be available for that services, doesn't get referred out. It happened to be that my toothache was resolved in a different way, but if it was something that festered for a while, when they get their dentist back here, it might take 4 or 5 hours of work to fix something like that rather than having it done now through a referral, and people are trying to find ways to save money. Where's the balance in all of this?
Well, and I actually wrote in my column today, one of the things that I think is essential is that tribes start building the case for additional revenue streams. And health is a good example of that. The administration is putting a lot of money into community health centers. And I think every tribe should apply for a community health center. And it's going to require a community conversation because it means doing some things differently. It means not saying necessarily IHS is the only route. But you look at IHS being, let's say, 45% of the revenue stream, Medicaid another 30%, and then this new money on top of that, and you could actually get close to a real health system that has enough money. IHS is not going to do that. We're not going to have the resources we need if we stick just with IHS.
I would agree. And third-party billings, and when you talk about having a conversation with the community, you're just talking about
Right.
local tribal members at Fort Hall. Is it only Shoshone Bannock that should be part of that conversation, or other Indians from other
It
tribes?
should,
Everybody?
well, to be a community health service, let's be clear about this. It means opening up the facility to everybody. It means being a community health center rather than a tribal one. And so it would mean other members of other tribes spouses of members of other tribes. It would mean non-Indians, maybe farm workers. And here's the selling point to tribal members, is that means more resources. So would you rather have a smaller clinic that you know can't even service you, or build a better facility that services more people? And I think that's kind of the philosophical question that has to be addressed.
And brings the issue of healthcare in a comprehensive way, perhaps home. That is, the
Right.
diet, the psychology, all the other things that go with healthcare in a lot of cases for healing people.
It's got to be all part of the mix, absolutely. The other thing I mentioned in my column today that I think tribes should do really quickly is create community foundations. When the budget cuts start coming down the pike, they're going to need some money that's flexible, that they can use for anything they want, whether it's scholarships or health centers. And one way to do that is to go down the list of every vendor who does business with the tribal government and say, we're starting this community foundation. We'd sure like to have you help us start it, and build some outside resources that way.
Same philosophy to any other programs. What's the future of Indian housing programs? They got a beautiful complex here that went up this summer, one of the best ones I've ever seen in terms of environmentally accessible things on these houses, but some people are saying it may be the last project they ever have here.
I think that might be. The metaphor I use in the column today is that the termination resolution, House Concurrent Resolution 108, was passed in August of 1953. That one day didn't change the world to termination. It became a long battle for the next 20 years. And I call this the era of contraction, and I think it's the same way, that the era has begun. And it's a question of how quickly some of these things get put into place, and then what kind of alternatives we build to mitigate.
How does the Native community hold the U.S. government and its citizens to its obligations? We noticed that the federal government ordered the Cherokee Nation to abide by the Treaty of 1866 and include the freedmen, which were their slaves, right, emancipated and made citizens of the nation on the treaty based on their request, that they were citizens of the Cherokee Nation, and therefore they had to, any vote needs to include them, and they have been included, at least temporarily. Why does it seem that when the U.S. government wants a tribe to abide by a treaty, they've got all kinds of, we're going to withhold housing funds, we're going to do this, but on the other end, it's a constant battle to say, look at here, Clause 5 says health care for the Indian community and education needs will be provided in exchange for lands and other goods and resources.
Right. Well, I think there ought to be some litigation over treaty rights. I think that would be a way to go. But the problem is a court cannot force Congress to fund it. And you're still going to bring it back to the Congress. Termination was a complete abrogation of treaty rights, and Congress got away with it. So as much as I believe treaties are the cornerstone of all this, I'm not sure that they give us any sort of guarantee. The other part is, how do you read treaties? Most treaties, for example, on healthcare say send a doctor. And the Indian Health Service is clearly far beyond that.
Indeed.
So, I mean, it gets into, what do you get out of the treaty? Is it literal reading? Is it broad interpretation?
Some might turn around and say, you got your one doctor and that's all we're going to give you, kind of a thing.
Right.
It just seems that the issue of obligations, though, goes on and on. There's so many non-natives who don't realize that we just can't stop paying on the mortgage because you think you've paid on it long enough under the contract. There is an end date, but on the treaties, there isn't an end date unless they're renegotiated.
And there ought to be a minimum obligation that both sides recognize. And maybe that's where we go with this, is try to say, well, what's the minimum required for you to be in compliance with the treaty, Mr. United States?
Yeah, as long as corporations can be people, can't the United States be a person?
Of course.
At least this president can say sovereignty.
Right.
Where's the what do we hear about education? Did OMB say anything about education funding into the tribes?
Well, the president has said that education is important, and that he doesn't. I mean, part of the demographic issue that concerns me is that you look at a retiring population that's consuming so many of the resources on Medicare or Social Security, and they're largely a white population. Yet you look at the population that needs help for education and healthcare, and it's largely Americans of color. And so you're going to have the group that's going to be paying the bills, the young people, funding a population that looks very different from them. And unless they reciprocate and do some investment on the young side, I think you have really something that tears at the fabric.
I was just thinking about this little philosophy because sometimes stepping back isn't that harmful. I've gotten rid of my smartphone because it wasn't smart enough to figure out how to get its phone calls to me, and I stepped back to a simpler phone, which works really good. People are stepping back and growing gardens. People are stepping back and figuring out ways to use less electricity by utilizing old methods of insulating and fuel burning. Is part of that philosophy is stepping back to slow food rather than fast foods? Is that something that the Native community can push that's helpful to resolve some of these issues we're facing on budget cuts?
I hope so. I think it's one area that we need to do a better job of communicating to our tribal members about. For example, we just built a brand new grocery store here on the reservation in Fort Hall, Idaho. It's smaller than the old store, and because of that size, they've reduced the capacity for vegetables. And you think about what you really need in healthy living, and it's not 2 aisles of soda pop. It's it's to have more fresh fruit and vegetables. I also think it's important that we do more experiments with native crops and to try to get away with figuring out which ones they may not have the yield of the old ones that are more commercially available, but they may have more nutrients that we haven't even thought of. Yesterday we had our first harvest of, we planted different types of corn, and we roasted blue corn, and we're going to steam it and dry some of the rest of the seeds. So we've been doing that at home.
Well, we've been harvesting the same thing. We had our first frost up here, so peppers are in, the tomatoes are being brought in, the beans are being brought in. There's a lot of stuff to mix and match with everything, and you see a lot more of that. We have a little farmers market across the street here for the second year out of
Oh,
all
that's
these years.
fabulous.
Um,
That's fabulous. We need one.
your blue corn was a little bit small though. The
It was a
ears,
little
you're
small, but the corn grew so damn tall. It was 6 and 7 and 8 feet tall, and I guess it took it out of the ears. So they were a little smaller than normal. We're going to try some things next year a little differently.
I think once you get into experimenting, you find out that there's literally hundreds of indigenous corn seeds for different climates
Right.
in different areas, and you just might have to find it. We get into these bartering places where squash seeds and bean seeds and people, growing corn. Beans are climbing up, and the squashes are below, meaning you don't have to do a whole lot of weeding and so forth, so they're compatible with each other. We need to find those compatible things. Mark, and you're going, what should we be looking forward in the next few weeks in the last minute here we have today?
The budget cuts are going to, the fight over the budget's going to get intense. Really, the elections in this document today from the Obama administration is an election document as much as anything. So the posturing on both sides is just going to get brutal. I think where you're going to see it hit immediately is they're going to have to come up with a continuing resolution for the rest for next year. The budget starts October 1st, and right now that's going to be a very difficult assignment. Followed immediately thereafter is going to be the whole problem of the super committee and what they come up with.
Are we going to get some jobs out of it eventually, do you think, this jobs bill, or is that doomed before we even get that far?
Most of it's doomed. I'd like to see something get through. I'd like to see the payroll tax cuts continue. It's interesting. They don't want to raise tax on millionaires, but they're damn sure ready to raise it on everybody else.
It's a Republican philosophy, I think. Good talking to you today. We'll get back to you again soon, and make sure that we get you on the Native News Updates so that your fans are happy about hearing the latest from DC.
Always is a light.
And that is another roundup of news from Indian Country on this edition of the Native News Update. Thanks for joining.